Many of you have asked me to make a tutorial about how I generate my Meshmixer supports, so here it is. Before we jump into Meshmixer, let's quickly take a look at why you might want to use these types of supports as opposed to the traditional support structures that you would see in Cura or Simplify 3D. Whenever support material makes contact with your mesh, it's going to leave a rough surface. Meshmixer allows you to minimize the point at which your supports contact your actual print, meaning that you can minimize the amount of rough surface area. So as you can see on this model, I have this feature here being supported, this part of the shirt being supported, while completely ignoring the rest of this top surface. This actually isn't touching my model at any point except for right here. It's floating just ever so slightly above the surface. It's supported down here, where once the torso is printed, we'll completely cover up any rough surface left behind. Also, some parts of the underarm just couldn't be helped. You just needed support there. So there will be a tiny rough surface wherever these supports contact it, but it'll be minimal. And it's such a nice print, even at 0.1 layer height, that it would be a shame to cover this whole thing in support like you would with some of the other support structures. However, these supports do come with a pretty large drawback, and that's this. They do have a tendency to break or wobble during a print if they get too tall. This is the arm for this model, and as you can see, I had to duct tape it halfway through the print because it started to wobble too much. And this added just a little bit of extra support so that it would fuse up here properly and then continue the print normally. If I had to print this again, I would generate this support in kind of a triangle and then have it meet at the point where the arm actually starts. This would have eliminated the wobble, but you learn from these things. So as you can see, here's the model with the arm. The only rough areas are where the supports contacted the mesh, and they're very, very small. If you were to cover this arm with traditional supports, the whole thing would be rough. Here, only the tiniest little parts actually needed to be supported, and then everything else could print fine from there. This is a lot easier to clean up than half an arm. So let's get into the actual program itself now. When you open up Meshmixer, you'll be greeted with a little panel that allows you to import your model. Once you have your model imported, it's going to spawn in a random place, so you're going to have to actually make sure it's on the build plate. So come down here to Edit, click Align, and then just hit Accept. You're going to have to zoom out or zoom in with middle mouse scroll. Middle mouse click and drag allows you to pan, and right click and drag allows you to rotate. Now that we have our model aligned to our build plate, let's make sure that it's oriented correctly. If you come up here to Edit and then Transform, you'll be greeted by these settings. If you're going to scale your model, you're going to have to do it here in Meshmixer because that will affect how the supports are generated. In my case, I want to make it twice as big. Any settings that you change here, if you switch to any other tool before you hit Accept, it will undo those settings and you will lose everything you've done. So make sure to hit Accept once you're done. This is your local and this is your world rotation. I want to rotate everything and manipulate it in world settings. So I'm going to rotate my model. There we go, that's about good enough. Most people print this particular model with the top of the head down on the build plate, but that's going to leave a rough surface here. And because you're going to be looking at this model, from the top down, that's a pretty awkward place to have a rough surface, especially considering that's going to be hard to sand. This is a lot of detail that I don't want to destroy. So I won't really be able to do much cleanup work here. And if I print it upside down, the eyelashes aren't going to have any sort of support. So I don't want to have to generate support on those. I'd rather they just print, without support. This orientation will allow me to do that. And this model, by the way, is about the hardest thing you're going to have to generate supports for. So if you can do something like this, then you'd be able to do pretty much any model. Now that it's oriented correctly, let's just hit Accept. Come down to Analyze and click on overhangs. Okay, so I've gone ahead and generated some support just so I can show you what all the different features of it are. So if you drop these down, you'll see you have a lot of options to play with. Most of these are self-explanatory. For example, angle threshold at 90 will basically say everything is an overhang. At 0, nothing's an overhang. So it just determines what angle is considered an overhang. Don't go overboard with this, but also make sure that it covers the areas that you want. These are what the supports look like. This is the base of the support, which is this setting here, base diameter. 8 millimeters usually works for me. Tip diameter is the tip that the smallest that the tip is going to get. You want that to be whatever your nozzle diameter is. In this case, I'm printing with a 0.4 nozzle, so 0.4. Post diameter is the diameter of the actual posts themselves. Density is just how dense the connection points are, how many of them there are. Let's see, what else is there? Tip height is this little tip section. How high do you want it to be? I'm keeping mine around 1 millimeter, and that seems to work great. Allow top connections, as far as I can tell, sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. For example, right now it's off, so I don't think these should have generated, but they did anyway, so who the hell knows. And then Y offset. Y offset, as you can see, my model is floating almost 3 millimeters off the surface, and everything in between it is support. That's what Y offset does. This is a Y offset, Y up program instead of Z up, so just Y is your Z here. Okay, so when you want to actually generate your supports, once you have your settings set to whatever you think is good, hit generate support. It'll take a bit. I would advise setting your post diameter not too low. If you set it too high, you won't get everything supported. If you set it too low, it's going to take ages to actually process. And the smaller this value is, the thinner your supports are and the weaker they are, and the more they're going to wobble or break off. So just keep that in mind. Same thing with density. You don't want to set this too high. You don't want to set this value here too low. If you want to make changes after you've generated support, you have to come down here and hit remove support. So if there are supports that you don't want, you can hold down Control and left click to get rid of them. If you want to add additional support, you can actually left click on your model and drag, and that'll generate a support usually. Sometimes it won't work, such as right now when I'm making a tutorial. Where I know it usually works is you can actually generate supports coming off of other supports and in between those supports as well. So you can kind of customize your supports that way, get rid of places where you don't want it, add it in places where you do. If you notice that you're not getting all of your features that need support supported, then you can try changing the post diameter, setting it lower, because if the posts are if they're too thick, they can actually interfere with each other, meaning you won't get all the coverage that you need. But if you set it too low, you will risk snapping them off or breaking them. So play around with that. This is going to require some experimentation on your part. Now, once you're done, hit convert to solid and create new object. Once you do that, it'll create a mesh. In fact, let's just go ahead and do it. Okay, so now I've generated my, my mesh. If you don't see this object browser, come up here to view and click here, show object browser. Now, there are usually going to be some errors. So go ahead and hide your actual mesh and click on this, and you can see we have some floating points and some stuff we don't need. To edit that, click on select, and you can circle it and just hit X, and that should get rid of it. Take your time, make sure to delete any, not to delete too much. Let me undo that. Make sure to delete just what you need, or rather what you don't want. Once that's done, you can select your first model, make it visible, come up here to export, and then export it as an STL, and then come down here and export your support structure as a separate mesh. That's very important. So let's hop into Simplify 3D. Once you import your two meshes into Simplify 3D, they might be in different parts of the build plate, or they'll look as if they're almost lined up perfectly. Do not trust that. Do this. Come up here and hit reset position on each one of them. So that way you know that it's exactly where it needs to be. Select both of them, come up here to transform, and then move them back onto your print bed. Now we're going to make two processes. Your main process is going to be, and you can name this whatever you want, your main process is going to be for your actual model, and then you'll have a separate process for your supports. Make sure not to have any support generated, because you already have supports now. Make sure to have your retraction lift setting set to at least double your layer height. So in this case, I'm printing at 0.1, but I have it set to 0.4, so 4 times as big. The reason this is important is that you don't want your nozzle bumping your supports, especially if you have them thin. Now, in your support process, same thing. Make sure to have your retraction vertical lift setting set to whatever value you want. Make sure to get rid of your scripts so that you don't have any starting or ending scripts, because that can interfere with your main process. After that, you're ready to slice. Oh, actually make sure to have the proper model selected in each of the layers. So here they are. Come down here to prepare print, select both of your processes and hit OK. Now that we have our model sliced, we can go ahead and inspect it to make sure everything looks good. And as you can see, our eyelashes will actually be able to be printed without any support. Everything else looks fine. There aren't any floating bits. Everything looks great. To help you inspect it, you can come down here and preview it by current process under coloring. So now you can see our supports are colored red, our actual model is colored blue, which means it's much easier to actually see where everything starts. After that, go ahead and give it a test print. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comment section below and I'll try to get to everyone. I'll be creating more tutorials about 3D printing, modeling, game development, all kinds of crazy things. So if you want to support the channel, remember to mail your neighbors cryptic facts about Nicolas Cage. It really helps the channel.